Alright, this is a Blender physics compilation I made. All of these were made in 2024 in the first half, basically January through June. And I'm just going to try to explain what I was thinking about whenever I made these animations. Alright, originally this right here was just a test concept, just to see if I could build the Kevin Plank walls and put good symmetrical curves in it. And then I just started adding force fields and simulating very cheap and simple explosions in order to just come up with some kind of physics simulation. And right here I'm just using basically force fields to make funny things happen to rigid bodies. And here I'm simulating explosions. Now in the original version it has audio, but I don't have the sound effects audio for this anymore. I'd have to rip it off of my YouTube channel, and I just don't want to do that. But it actually looked much better whenever I sped it up like this. At least I think so. Of course, I have no idea why I had a sun in the middle of it, other than because I thought it looked pretty. And I love particle physics. Here I just have some molecular script simulations going on, basically pouring different colored molecular script particles into these cups, as basically all the emitters are inside of the faucet type thing, and they're just emitting particles, and it's all keyframes so that they go into the cups. And then I start using force fields to manipulate the particles. Right now I'm using one force field to control all the particles at the same time, a very simple version of it. And later on you'll see why, like right here, I start using individual force fields that affect only a certain color particle. And you do that through groupings, creating groups and so forth. But it took me a long time to get this set up because there's a whole lot of keyframes to it, and trying to keep track of all the keyframes for all the individual force fields and keep it in sync with all the other ones, because they don't, like you can see, the force fields don't all engage at the same time. But trying to keep track of it in your head at the same time is a little bit difficult for me, especially since my brain is old. But I kind of like the look of stuff like this, especially when you have weird lighting, like at the glasses, the bottom of the glasses glow, and whenever you add like ray tracing in glass and stuff like that, I really like the look of it. And I kind of like dark scenes. That's why a lot of my scenes are just kind of dark. Like this is not a very bright scene. And this, in terms of physics, is very similar to the previous one. And I tend to, whenever I make simulations like this, I tend to make it very simple at first and then add more dynamics to it as I go along. Like you'll see a bunch of similar iterations of the same physics simulation, and then like with this one, the difference is the cups were rigid bodies, and they were being affected by centripetal force whenever that platform started spinning, and they're also being affected by force fields at the moment, although barely affected, because the force fields don't affect rigid bodies quite as much, because rigid bodies are much heavier typically. And this right here is just another one, centripetal force. Those monster trucks, they're just rolling freely, and it's just centripetal force that's kind of pushing them off. And the building, of course, is rigid bodies. And if you watch the trees, they're actually attached to the platform by a constraint that can flex. So whenever the platform comes to a stop real quick, the trees sway. Or if something hits the trees may sway. And of course, I put a SpaceX Starship on there just because. In some ways, these are just entertaining to me. And I'm sure other people kind of like watching them as well. Although not a whole lot of people, I'm sure. And the biggest difference between these is how quickly it gains speed in terms of rotation and the maximum top speed, because they all come to a complete stop instantly. I think I was increasing the rotation speed by like 20% each iteration, something like that. I don't quite remember. The Starship was kind of spazzing out. One of the wings fell through the floor. Of course, right here, it's basically the same setup, but the difference is the platform, the circle that it's all resting on, is actually shaking as if it's experiencing an earthquake. And I'm slowly ramping up the power of the earthquake. Of course, you can't really tell at first, but you can later on, like right here, you can tell a little bit it's starting to shake. Yeah, you can definitely see it shaking and baking there. And on the close-ups, you could see it more clearly that it's shaking. And of course, every time you see that truck jump, that's a new iteration. Like right there. And I'm basically just using a noise generator on the keyframes of that platform. And another thing I really like is fluid simulations. Flip Fluids is by far the best fluid simulator I have personally ever used. I can't say it's the best altogether because I haven't used all of them. But out of the ones I've used, I like it the best. I only wish I could figure out how to make force fields affect only the fluid that came from a specific fluid inflow object. But I don't think it's actually possible. Not right now anyway, unless I'm just doing something wrong. But when it comes to particles, of course, it's very easy to just use groups. And I've tried using groups and flip fluids and never could get it to work quite right. And I kind of like these. I call them silly strings. It's basically just molecular script particles that are connected together at birth with basically constraints, except they're being auto-generated. And it kind of wiggles like silly string. And of course with these I will use force fields, and sometimes use force fields that only affect certain colors. Interior scenes like this have always been kind of noisy and hard to, or more time consuming to render, so I put a significant amount of time into optimizing the rendering when it comes to stuff like this, so I don't have to render for days. Because you can see a little bit of noise in this, but all in all it's not that bad, and I think I was averaging maybe 45 seconds per frame. And I'm not using real powerful cards. I got decent cards. I got a 3080 Ti and a 3060 in this in my main computer, and I have a 3070 and two 2060 Supers in my secondary computer that I only use for rendering. Well, I use it for a file server as well, but you know, the only heavy lifting it does is rendering. And one of the things I did was, if you watch the steps in the background, the glow, it sort of has like an aurora effect. And I did that by creating a video that has a what do they call that? Kind of like a gradient color, and I basically shifted an image from right to left to create a video using keyframes, and then used that video and UV mapped it onto the steps, and basically that's how the steps turned out like that. Of course, with the really slow particles, I actually baked them a little bit slower than normal, but I'm actually using time remapping in order to slow down the particles, I think by about 20 times. That way I could do this part. You can actually tell, if you look at that, those pink particles are kind of jerking, and that's one of the side effects of using time, that time remapping thing. But I kind of like how this scene is, just camera moving through all these slow particles. And this was another one that was difficult to optimize to get it to render in a decent amount of time because of it being an interior scene. And of course these are molecular script particles. I think each one of these had, like, I want to say somewhere around 10,000 particles in each cube, something like that. I don't quite remember. And of course I like using slow motion ever since 1999 and The Matrix came out. Bullet time has been all the rage with me. Anyway, my throat's a little dry today. Allergies are kind of bad. And I like all the collision effects. Of course, the Molecular Plus add-on, it's more efficient, it's quicker to simulate, but I don't feel like I have as good of control over it as I did with the original molecular script that Pyro Evil came out with. Especially when it comes to cubes of particles. And of course I have to throw in some force fields and use grouping to control which particles are attracted to each force field. Now, fluid particles I like, but for some reason fluid particles take a long time to simulate. Even on my 3900X CPU, granted it's used to be a really powerful CPU, now it's just a little bit better than I'd say what the average person has. But back when I purchased it, it was probably in the 90th percentile. Now it's somewhere around 70 in terms of how powerful it is. And of course I'm once again using force fields with groups. And as the different iterations of this go on, they get more and more complicated, and the key framing of the force fields and all that stuff get more complicated and more difficult to keep track of with my old brain. But I think one reason why I do a lot of this stuff is to help keep my brain sharp, because I'm not that smart of a person. And I think whenever older people like me, if they want to keep their brain working right, they should probably, do stuff like this. Do anything that keeps their brain active. And sometimes I overuse depth of field. I can tell watching this now that I overused depth of field, especially right there. It got really, really blurry, and I don't even remember what I was trying to focus on. I want to get back into doing more physics simulations. Probably more rigid body physics. But I just ain't had a whole lot of time lately. And this scene, it pretty much describes randomness. I have a Blender logo, a computer monitor, two computer monitors, a dumpster, a starship, one of those speed land record things. I can't remember what that one is specifically called at the moment. A stop sign and a do not enter sign, and some concrete blocks. I just started throwing stuff in there, and a couple mirrors. Just start throwing weird objects in there, and adding particles, adding force fields, adding groups, dice. I forgot about the dice. And then of course the overhead lights. Well, I tell you what, these simulations are way easier to do now than they were back in 2015 when I downloaded Blender for the first time and had no idea how to do any of this stuff. And it didn't help that my computer was a laptop with a AMD CPU, or rather an AMD APU, because it had no discrete graphics or anything like that. It was just a 2-core CPU without hyperthreading. So you only had 2 cores, and doing anything like this, it took so long. I mean, literally 50 times longer. And rendering was out of question. I couldn't render this stuff with that. I had to use Sheepit, which is like a rendering community type thing, in order to render my projects. Here I'm using flip fluids, high viscosity flip fluids. Of course, the flip fluids was penetrating the walls of that dumpster, and I couldn't get it to stop doing that. And this, believe it or not, this is actually flip fluids as well, except I don't have a mesh, and I'm having it actually generate the particles for the fluid itself. And of course I am using color box to actually mix individual colors. And what I wasn't actually expecting is that it would work with the particles. And the particles were actually changing colors, or mixing, their colors were mixing as well. And this, of course, is color box with flip fluids. Is it color box or mix box? It may be mix box, but you get what I mean. Basically, a new part of flip fluids that they added maybe a year ago that allows you to actually mix different colors of fluids. And of course, here's just some rigid body towers made with Kevlar planks with a whole bunch of spheres inside of a rigid body bowl that's spinning, and centripetal force is ejecting the spheres and tearing down the Kevlar plank buildings. Of course, I added that red stripe onto the bow because whenever I first started rendering it, you couldn't hardly tell that the bow was spinning because it didn't have any texture to it. It was just plain glass. So I added that red stripe just so it'd make it easier to see that the bow was spinning. Again, right here, I'm kind of overusing depth of field, but it works fine even with this much depth of field whenever the camera's sitting steady. But if the camera's moving around, it kind of looks weird. I just kind of like the way that looked. Of course, that's fluid particles. I tried that with molecular script particles, and I just could not get it to work quite right. I don't know why, but it worked way better with fluid particles instead of molecular script particles. Hopefully you're not having any trouble hearing me, because my voice is kind of weak because allergies are bad, my throat's irritated. And I'm constantly having to take a sip of water to keep my throat from getting too dry. Yeah, I was wondering if I couldn't remember if I used force fields in this one or not. Apparently it's pretty much a constant for me. It seemed like I always use force fields. Believe it or not, this was actually quite difficult to get to work quite right. Because I'm using rigid body chains with constraints to hold the links together. And basically it's all acting dynamically. The only thing that's keyframed is the position of the frame at the top, basically the square frame. I was having issues with either the chain being too stretchy, or like in this case, one of the chains are a little bit longer than the other. I don't know how that happened, and it causes one side to sit lower and everything want to fall that direction. But I've been kind of thinking about doing a simulation like this for quite a while, and the couple times I tried it, it just did not work quite right, and this was the only time I was able to get it to work somewhat okay. See how it's leaning all to that one side, and once gravity takes over, it just all falls. I actually baked this probably 5 or 6 times, making small changes to it to get the building to try to stay together a little bit longer. I even started using constraints to hold the building together, but I ended up not actually rendering any of them out because it just didn't look right. It looks like I'm almost at the end of this little compilation. If you just made it around this long, that's good. Maybe I'm not that boring. Who knows? But this right here, I had to bake all of it in rigid body and then bake it to keyframes and then do the fluid portion. But anyway, I guess that's about it, because got about 10 or 15 seconds left on this. Thanks for watching. Later, people.